The silence in the Kwan mansion was a living thing. It had weight and texture, pressing in on Alara Vance from the cool marble floors to the impossibly high, coffered ceilings. It was the sound of wealth so vast it no longer needed to announce itself. For 3 weeks, Alara had moved through that silence, her light blue scrubs a soft, jarring note of color in a world of monochrome grays, blacks, and creams. Her charge, the matriarch of the house, Mrs. Kwan, was the epicenter of the quiet. She sat in her state-of-the-art wheelchair, a ghost in fine silk, her eyes fixed on the manicured gardens beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, seeing nothing. Alara was the 5th nurse in as many months. The others, she'd been told by the terse head of staff, had failed. They had been too loud, too cheerful, too clinical, too something. They had failed to break through the wall of silence Mrs. Kwan had built around herself 5 years ago, the day her husband was buried. Alara's job was simple on paper. Monitor her vitals, administer her medication, ensure her comfort. The unspoken part of the job description was the real challenge. Endure the silence. And endure the sun. Kwan Jae-hwan. She had only seen him a handful of times, but his presence was a permanent fixture in the house, a low-frequency hum of authority that vibrated through the walls. He never raised his voice. He never had to. He moved like the world was built for his convenience, his custom-made shoes making no sound on the polished floors. He was always dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. Tom Ford, she recognized from the cut. Dark charcoal, razor-sharp lapels, and a tie knotted with surgical precision. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive fabrics. But it was his eyes that held the true measure of his power. They were dark, depthless, and saw everything. When they landed on her, she felt catalogued, assessed, and dismissed in the space of a single heartbeat. Today, the silence felt different. Thicker. A storm was rolling in, darkening the sky outside and making the room feel even more like a gilded cage. Alara was preparing Mrs. Kwan's afternoon tea, her movements practiced and quiet. She set the delicate porcelain cup on the table beside the wheelchair. Mrs. Kwan didn't stir. Her hands, gnarled with age but still elegant, lay limp in her lap. Alara knelt beside the chair, her voice soft. "Mrs. Kwan? It's time for your tea." Nothing. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. This was the daily ritual. The offering, the refusal. Alara would wait a prescribed 10 minutes before clearing the untouched service away. She settled back on her heels, her gaze drifting to the window. The first drops of rain began to streak down the glass. A small sound, fragile as a falling leaf, broke the stillness. Alara tensed, turning back to the old woman. Mrs. Kwan's lips were trembling, parted slightly. A single word escaped, a breath of a sound, raspy from disuse. A Korean word. Gajima. Don't go. The word struck Alara like a physical blow. It was a plea, desperate and raw, and it bypassed every professional wall she had meticulously constructed. It was the first word the woman had spoken in 5 years, and she had spoken it to her. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, without remembering where she was or who she was, Alara answered. Her own voice was a whisper, the Korean flowing from her as naturally as breath, a language of her own past, a secret she kept folded away. "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured in perfect, gentle Korean. "I am here." It was like turning a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. A shudder racked Mrs. Kwan's frail body. Her head turned, slowly, painfully, until her dark, clouded eyes met Alara's. And then they filled with tears. Not quiet, dignified tears, but a flood of unrestrained, gut-wrenching sobs that tore through the suffocating silence of the room. She was weeping for 5 years of unspoken grief, and the sound was horrifying and beautiful all at once. Alara reached out instinctively, her hand covering the old woman's trembling one. She just held on, whispering reassurances in a language no one else in this house was supposed to know she understood. That was the moment everything changed. "What is this?" The voice was ice. It cut through the sound of the storm and the old woman's cries, dropping the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Alara's head snapped up. Kwon Jae-hwan stood in the doorway. He wasn't looking at his weeping mother. His gaze was fixed on Alara, on her hand covering his mother's, on her face. It was an expression of absolute, lethal stillness. He had heard. He had understood. The carefully constructed, professionally distant world Alara had built for herself shattered into a million pieces. She had made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. She slowly withdrew her hand from Mrs. Kwon's, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked into the room, his movements deliberate, predatory. He stopped before them, looking down not at his mother, but at Alara. The scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp like cedar and cold rain, filled the air around her. "You will explain," he said.
It was not a request.
And Alara knew, with a chilling certainty that went bone deep, that she was not just the nurse anymore. She was a key, and a man like Kwon Jae-hwan did not let go of his keys. The doors of the mansion had never felt so heavy, so final. They had just locked behind her. She was moved into a suite on the second floor that evening. It wasn't a request. A grim-faced man in a dark suit had appeared at her side and informed her that Mr. Kwon had decided it was best for her to reside on the premises for the foreseeable future, to provide uninterrupted care for his mother. Her things would be collected from her small apartment. Her contract was being amended. The suite was larger than her entire apartment, a sterile masterpiece of beige silk and dark wood. It had a balcony overlooking the rain-slicked gardens, a bathroom carved from a quarry of gray marble, and a bed that could sleep four. It was luxurious. It was a cage. Jae-hwan summoned her to his study an hour later. The room was like the man, dark, orderly, and intimidating. One wall was a window looking out at the city lights, blurred by the storm. The others were lined with books that looked as if they had never been read. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Alara sat, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had changed out of her scrubs into the simple black dress and cardigan the staff had provided. She felt exposed, stripped of her professional armor. He didn't speak for a long time, just swirled the liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "My mother has not spoken a word since the day of my father's funeral," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He was stating a fact, not sharing a confidence. The doctors called it selective mutism, a prison of trauma. They said nothing could reach her. He set the glass down, the sound a sharp report. He leaned forward, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "You reached her. How?" I speak some Korean," Alara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I grew up in a community with a lot of first-generation Korean immigrants. I learned it from my neighbors, my friends. She had always been good with languages, a sponge for syntax and sound. It was a part of her she rarely shared. It was too personal." "You failed to note this particular skill on your application," he stated. "It wasn't relevant to my nursing qualifications." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face. "It has become relevant. She asked you not to go."
Why?
Alara thought of the raw desperation in that one whispered word. "I don't know. I was about to clear her tea. Maybe she thought I was leaving for the day." He stared at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. He was searching for lies, for angles, for some hidden leverage. She met his stare, refusing to look away. She had nothing to hide. Her only crime was a moment of impulsive compassion. "My father's death was not peaceful," Jae-hwan said, his voice dropping even lower. "It was a betrayal. By family. My mother saw it." The confession hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. This was his wound, the source of the mansion's oppressive silence. It wasn't just grief. It was the poison of treachery. He hadn't just lost a father. His entire world had been fractured by the person who was supposed to be loyal. He had failed to protect his father, and now he was failing to comfort the only witness, his own mother. Her silence was his constant, public failure. She is the only one who knows the truth of what happened, he continued. And for 5 years, that truth has been locked inside her.
Until today.
Until you. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. The impeccable lines of his suit pulled taut across his broad shoulders. The men responsible for my father's death are still a threat. They believe my mother is a broken doll who will never speak again. They are wrong. You have just proven them wrong. The implication was terrifying. By becoming the one person who could communicate with Mrs. Kwon, Allure had painted a target on her own back. She was no longer an invisible caregiver. She was a threat to powerful, dangerous men. You will not leave this house, he said, turning back to face her. My head of security will be your shadow. You will continue your duties. You will talk to my mother. And you will report every single word she says directly to me. Is that understood? Allure's throat was dry. This was it. The point of no return. She could refuse. She could scream and demand to be let go. But looking at the cold certainty in his eyes, she knew it would be useless. She was his property now, an asset in a war she wanted no part of. But then, an image of Mrs. Kwon's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind. The profound loneliness in her eyes. The desperate plea in her voice. For 5 years, that woman had been trapped in silence, alone with her horrors. Allure was the first glimmer of light in that long, dark tunnel. She could have run. There was a moment, 2 weeks later, when the opportunity presented itself. A shift change, a miscommunication between the security guards. The gate at the end of the long driveway was ajar for less than a minute. Allure was in the garden with Mrs. Kwon, pushing her wheelchair along a stone path.
She saw it. The gap.
The street beyond. Freedom. Her heart leaped into her throat. She could make a run for it. Scream for help. Disappear back into her anonymous life. She stopped the wheelchair, her hands trembling on the handles. She looked down at Mrs. Kwon. The old woman was watching a butterfly dance on a rosebush, a flicker of something peaceful in her expression that hadn't been there weeks ago. If Allure left, that peace would vanish. The silence would rush back in, and Mrs. Kwon would be alone again. Jae-hwan would find another nurse, but it wouldn't be the same. The fragile trust, the shared language, would be broken. Allure took a deep breath, the scent of roses filling her lungs. She made a choice. She pushed the wheelchair forward, away from the gate, back toward the cold, beautiful prison of the house. He was waiting for her on the veranda, leaning against a pillar, watching her.
Jae-hwan.
He must have seen it all on the security cameras. The open gate. Her hesitation. Her choice. As she pushed the wheelchair up the ramp, he stepped forward, blocking her path. He sent the guard away with a flick of his wrist. They were alone. You could have left, he said, his voice a low rumble. My shift wasn't over, she replied, her voice clipped. He took a step closer. He was too close. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that no one else would ever notice. He was not a man who allowed himself to be tired. Why did you stay, Allure? He asked. He said her name differently than anyone else. It wasn't soft, but it was specific. Waited. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. She needed me. His eyes searched hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation. It was a crack in the armor, a flash of something raw and vulnerable. He was the most powerful man she had ever met, a king in his own brutal empire. But in this one thing, he was helpless. He couldn't give his mother what she needed. But Allure could. No one has ever needed me, he said, the admission so quiet she almost missed it. The space between them crackled with unspoken words. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. It was a moment of dangerous gravity, a silent confession of a different kind of need. The air was thick with it, heavy with the scent of cedar and roses and the coming rain. He didn't touch her, but she felt branded by his attention all the same. That was the moment she knew her survival was no longer the only thing at stake. The breakthrough came a week later. Allure was reading to Mrs. Kwon in Korean from a book of poetry. The old woman's hand suddenly shot out and gripped Alara's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "The scar," Mrs. Kwon whispered in Korean, her eyes wide with a remembered terror. The man with the scar on his hand. Alara's blood ran cold. "What man, Mrs. Kwon? Who had a scar?" "Brother," she breathed. "His brother. Jae-hwan's uncle. The one who had delivered the eulogy at his father's funeral." Alara had seen him in a family photograph on the mantelpiece, a smiling, avuncular man with his arm around Jae-hwan's father. She now had a name, a detail, a weapon. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't give this information to a guard or a functionary. It was for Jae-hwan alone. She had crossed a line. She was no longer a neutral party, a caregiver caught in the crossfire. She had chosen her side. She found him in his study, poring over financial documents. She relayed her conversation with his mother, her voice low and urgent. He listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When she finished, he stood and walked over to a liquor cabinet, pouring 2 glasses this time. He handed one to her. "You should have run when you had the chance," he said, his voice flat. "Now you are part of this." "I know," she replied, her fingers steady around the cool glass. He took a drink, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of his glass. "My mother hasn't looked at anyone with hope in 5 years. Until you." The words were a confession of debt, of reliance, of something far more dangerous than affection. It was a claim. The enemy made their move 2 days later. It wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was quieter, more personal. A package arrived, addressed to her. Alara Vance. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, framed photograph of her mother that had always sat on her bedside table in her old apartment. And lying on top of the glass was a single, withered black rose. It was a message. "We know who you are. We know where you came from. We can touch your world." Jae-hwan saw it. He walked into the room as she stared at the contents of the box, her blood roaring in her ears. He took the box from her numb fingers, his expression turning from cold control to black fury. The war was no longer just his. They had targeted her. And in doing so, they had signed their own death warrants. He had allowed a vulnerability into his life, and now his enemies were trying to use it against him. He would burn their world to the ground for it. The assault came at dusk. It was swift and brutal. An explosion at the main gate served as a diversion, while a team of armed men scaled the rear wall, their objective clear: get to the 2nd floor. Silence the old woman and the nurse who had given her a voice. Alarms blared through the mansion. Alara's training kicked in. She locked the heavy oak door to Mrs. Kwon's suite, her mind racing. She pushed a heavy armchair against it, her muscles straining. Mrs. Kwon was whimpering in her chair, her hands clutching the armrests, the sounds of gunfire outside bringing the horror of the past back to her. "It's okay," Alara said in Korean, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I will not let them harm you." She was not just a nurse. She was a protector. The handle of the door rattled violently, followed by the splintering crack of a boot kicking the wood. They were coming through. Jae-hwan and his men were engaged in a firefight downstairs. She could hear the disciplined reports of their weapons against the chaotic spray of the attackers.
No one was coming for them in time.
Alara's eyes scanned the room, landing on a heavy, marble-based lamp on a side table. It was her only weapon. She grabbed it, the base cold and solid in her hands. She didn't hide. She didn't cower. She moved to the side of the door, pressing herself flat against the wall, hoisting the lamp like a club. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a nurse. She was trained to save lives, not take them. But she would not let them get to her patient. The door burst inward with a final, violent crack. A man in black tactical gear stormed in, a suppressed pistol in his hand. He swept the room, his eyes landing on the wheelchair first. That was his mistake. He didn't see her. With a cry that was torn from the depths of her soul, Alara swung the lamp with all her strength. The heavy marble base connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the floor without a sound, his weapon clattering across the hardwood. Allure stood over him, shaking, panting, the lamp still clutched in her hands. The adrenaline was afire in her veins. She had done it. She had saved them. The fighting outside the room stopped. A moment of ringing silence, and then the door was kicked fully open. Jae-hwan stood there, a pistol in his hand, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with grime, and a smear of blood that wasn't his. His eyes took in the scene. The man on the floor, Mrs. Kwon safe in her chair, and Allure, standing guard.
Fierce.
Terrified. Unbroken. He holstered his weapon, his men securing the rest of the house behind him. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. He stopped in front of her and gently took the lamp from her hands, setting it aside. His fingers brushed hers, and a jolt went through her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say a word. He raised his hand, and his thumb brushed a smudge of dust from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. In his eyes, she saw it all: awe, respect, and a raw, possessive darkness that stole her breath. "You are mine to protect now," he said, his voice rough. It was not a promise of safety. It was a statement of fact.
A vow.
A brand. He was claiming her, not as an asset, but as part of his soul. Her old life was gone. It had burned away in the firefight, in the moment she chose to fight instead of flee. The cost of her survival, of Mrs. Kwon's survival, was the woman she used to be. The cost for him was greater. He had let someone into the fortress of his heart, a liability he had sworn he would never have again. Weeks later, the mansion was restored to its pristine state. The silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of grief, but a calm, peaceful stillness. In the garden, under the warm afternoon sun, Mrs. Kwon was telling Allure a story about the rose bushes her husband had planted, her voice still weak but clear. Allure listened, laughing softly at one of the old woman's remarks. From the window of his study, Kwon Jae-hwan watched them. He was no longer just watching his mother. He was watching the woman who had walked into the heart of his darkness and refused to be extinguished. She was not just a key, she was the light. He had made his choice the day he locked her in. She had made hers the day she refused to run. This was their world now, built on a foundation of violence and secrets, but with a future he had never believed possible. He turned from the window, the cold mask of the boss back in place, but his eyes held a new warmth. Their life had begun not with a gentle word, but with a desperate one. And it was a language only they would ever truly understand.